Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 3 of The New Right. Our questions to think about: how does the Watergate scandal turn into an impeachment crisis for President Nixon? And second, how does the Watergate scandal lead to the election of President Jimmy Carter? First of all, taking a step back to that election map of 1972 that we saw earlier, some more of the backstory here. Coming into this election, it looked like George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, was going to challenge Richard Nixon for the conservative vote. So he was going to be running as a possible third-party candidate, but that could have robbed the most conservatives away from Richard Nixon's Republican Party. But on May 15th, 1972, Arthur Bremer shot George Wallace 5 times during a campaign stop in Maryland. And what's interesting about Arthur Bremer is that he just wanted to be famous. And he had actually considered trying to shoot President Nixon, but he just settled on George Wallace. George Wallace actually lives, although he would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. So it's important to understand that the removal of George Wallace from the election helps to pave the way for Nixon's landslide re-election in 1972. The Watergate scandal is related to the presidential election of 1972 because after the leak of the Pentagon Papers, President Nixon was very concerned about unauthorized leaks to the press. And if you're worried about leaks, you call in the plumbers. So the White House had this informal office of covert surveillance that was investigating national security breaches. But in 1972, with the campaign effort, the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP, and I'm not making that up, sort of expands out into spying on Nixon's Democratic opponents and engaging in all kinds of political dirty tricks. The big story comes in June of 1972 when members connected to CREEP break into the Democratic National Committee campaign headquarters located in the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. They are there to look through the files, to find out the Democratic strategies, and to bug the rooms and the phones so that they have this constant supply of information about what the Democrats are doing. Now, despite the fact that one of these burglars is a former member of the CIA, they get caught red-handed. I mean, they are caught in the act. And so, of course, this is front page news in the fact that this is a presidential election year and somebody's been caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee campaign headquarters. But the reason this doesn't go any farther is because President Nixon personally ordered the cover-up of the connection between the break-in and CREEP and the campaign. And so the burglars are paid to keep quiet. And this sort of story just sort of falls from the front pages. The burglars are convicted in January of 1973, but by that point, Richard Nixon has already been reelected by a landslide. But then it begins to unravel. James McCord was that former member of the CIA who was one of the Watergate burglars. He had been sentenced to a particularly long jail term by the judge. And so McCord asks for leniency, and he tells the judge that he had received money from the White House and that he had been promised a presidential pardon in return for his silence. So this breaks the story once again wide open. And about the same time, John Dean, who was Nixon's legal counsel, gets fired because he begins to cooperate with the prosecutors and the investigations that are created to find out how involved the president or the White House was. And so John Dean is the one who testifies that there had been a White House orchestrated cover-up approved by President Nixon. And the reason that John Dean is doing this is that he doesn't want to become the scapegoat for President Nixon. But because Nixon refused to turn over any of the documents to the investigators, it's essentially his word against Dean's. So we don't get anywhere with this. The Senate formulates a committee to investigate the connections between the Watergate break-in and the alleged cover-up. And it's the Senate committee that learns of the existence of an Oval Office recording system. What's interesting here is that this system had actually been installed during the Kennedy administration because John Kennedy wanted to be able to recall certain conversations in his presidency when it came time to write his memoirs. And then Johnson had used it intermittently, but it's not until Nixon comes into the White House that we really see consistent use of this recording equipment. And so Nixon has been using this system regularly since 1970. And when the Senate committee learns of this system, it sort of becomes the beginning of the end for Nixon. And the big questions that the Senate committee wants to know is, what did the president know and when did he know it? That was their phrase they repeated over and over again, because they're questioning, is this something that's happening behind Nixon's back that he doesn't know anything about? Or is this something that Nixon is orchestrating himself? Either way, the Senate committee is not immediately going to have access to the tapes because President Nixon is going to cite executive privilege in withholding the tapes. In other words, Nixon argues that it is a matter of national security that these tapes not be released. And so that ties in with your journal about Watergate. We get to the point in the scandal where the Justice Department has created an office of the special prosecutor, and that special prosecutor was Archibald Cox. To give you some sort of modern context for this, Robert Mueller was investigating any possible connections between Donald Trump and Russian interference with the 2016 election. He was a special prosecutor. So that sort of gives you some modern context for this job here. So he's looking for any possible connection between Richard Nixon and the break-in at the Democratic National Committee campaign headquarters. And it's going to be Archibald Cox who is continually pressing Nixon to release the tapes. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and we get into this moment called the Saturday Night Massacre. Nobody dies, but a whole lot of people are going to lose their jobs. The head of the Justice Department, we've mentioned before, is the Attorney General. And that man was Elliot Richardson. Elliot Richardson is effectively Archibald Cox's boss. And as the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson has been appointed to this position by President Nixon. So his boss is President Nixon. And Nixon is going to meet with Elliot Richardson and tell him to fire Archibald Cox. Richardson refuses and resigns. So, undeterred, President Nixon goes to the second in line in the Justice Department, which is the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus. Nixon then tells Ruckelshaus to fire Archibald Cox. Ruckelshaus says no and resigns. I mean, think about it. Think about what President Nixon is trying to do in this moment. He is trying to fire the man investigating him and the possibility that he committed a crime. It's wild. But Nixon goes further. Once Ruckelshaus resigns, he goes to the man who is third in line in the Justice Department, the Solicitor General Robert Bork. And he fires Archibald Cox. The Saturday Night Massacre. But we still have this issue of the White House tapes. Just because Archibald Cox is now unemployed doesn't mean that a new special prosecutor is not going to continue to press Nixon for the tapes. That new special prosecutor was Leon Jaworski. So he is now investigating this connection, and he is the one who is continually pressing President Nixon to release the tapes. In April of 1974, President Nixon is going to release over 1,200 pages of transcribed recordings that he had edited himself. So think about this. This is the guy who's being investigated, and there are tape recordings that he is listening to and typing up his own transcription. So not surprisingly, there are huge gaps in this conversation, which Nixon claims he's protecting national security. He's also substituting the phrase expletive deleted for the vulgar language and anti-Semitic rants that he frequently unleashed in the White House. So coming into mid-1974, this case goes to the Supreme Court. And the question really is this a matter of national security? Can President Nixon continue to withhold this evidence from the special prosecutor? And in July, the Supreme Court orders Nixon to turn over the tapes. And Nixon, of course, seeing the writing on the wall, is going to hand over the White House tapes to the investigators. But the story, it just doesn't stop. There is a mysterious 18-minute gap in one of the early conversations. And Nixon's personal secretary, Miss Rosemary Woods, claims that she must have accidentally recorded over that portion of this tape, this critical moment in the tape when she went to go answer the phone. And she even sort of demonstrated this in this moment where she did the Rosemary stretch, because these two pieces of equipment were on opposite corners of her desk. And she must have been in like some weird yoga position to actually make this work. But despite this mysterious 18-minute gap, which we still don't know actually is about, there is enough evidence to prove that President Nixon personally ordered the cover-up of the break-in of the DNC headquarters. Okay, so at this point, the House Judiciary Committee within the House of Representatives is voting to recommend 3 articles of impeachment against President Nixon. Obstruction of justice for the payment of hush money to witnesses and the withholding of evidence, abuse of power through the use of federal agencies to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights. Because at one point, when the FBI begins their investigation, Nixon tries to have the CIA tell the FBI to back off of the investigation because it involves national security. And then the third article of impeachment, or proposed article of impeachment, is contempt or defiance of Congress for withholding the tapes. Now, before we get into this conversation, I need to explain very briefly the process of impeachment. It is a 2-step process. It begins with the House of Representatives, where they draw up articles of impeachment. These are the alleged offenses or crimes that the president has committed. According to the Constitution, the president can be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The problem for most Americans when they hear those words is they think of a misdemeanor as a low-level crime. And what misdemeanor means in a political context is bad political behavior. So politicians behaving badly. And that's an important distinction because the president doesn't have to have actually committed a crime punishable by any statute. He just has to be guilty of bad behavior. And this is something that came up during the impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump. Okay, so back to the process. Step one happens in the House of Representatives. They draw up articles of impeachment, and once they vote in favor of those articles, the president has in fact been impeached. But he is not removed from office because the word impeach simply means to call someone's integrity into question or to accuse. So you're accusing him of these crimes, or you're accusing him of this bad political behavior. But if you're accused of something, there should be a trial. And that trial would take place in the Senate, with the senators acting as the jurors. So just like a regular trial, you have the presentation of the prosecution, the presentation by the defense, and then the jury votes. We've done this now 3 times, with Andrew Johnson in 1868, with Bill Clinton in 1999, and most recently with Donald Trump in 2019. But none of this actually takes place for Richard Nixon because he resigns before the House of Representatives could vote on these articles of impeachment. So I want to emphasize, Richard Nixon was not impeached because he resigned before that process could begin. Okay, so just in case this story isn't weird enough, we have a situation involving the vice president. When Richard Nixon was reelected in 1972, his vice presidential candidate was a guy named Spiro Agnew. And this guy is a shady character. In fact, Spiro Agnew is going to end up resigning in October of 1973 for allegedly taking bribes from contractors both before and during his time as the vice president. And so this brings up the question for many historians, is this the reason why impeachment of Richard Nixon didn't begin sooner? Because nobody wants to see President Spiro Agnew at all. So once Spiro Agnew resigns, President Nixon is going to use the 25th Amendment to appoint a new vice president. So under the terms of the 25th Amendment, the president has the authority to appoint a new vice president to be confirmed by the Senate. And that's exactly what Richard Nixon does. He nominates Gerald Ford of Michigan as the new VP because by all accounts, Gerald Ford is a good person. He's been described as a Boy Scout, not someone shady like Spiro Agnew. And so he's confirmed. But once Richard Nixon resigns, Gerald Ford becomes the president. And that means there's a new vacancy in the office of the vice president. So Gerald Ford is going to use the 25th Amendment to nominate Nelson Rockefeller of New York. And so now we have a situation where the United States has a president and a vice president that nobody voted for. And then Gerald Ford basically destroys his own political career when he gives a full, free, and absolute pardon to Richard Nixon. He absolves Nixon of any wrongdoing, essentially, which means Nixon can never be charged with any crime related to the Watergate scandal. From Ford's perspective, he wanted to end the nightmare, but to the American public, who's already super critical of what's going on in Washington, it kind of looks like Nixon and Ford had some kind of deal worked out in advance. But that pardon is going to cripple Gerald Ford's presidency. And he's having to face a really powerful challenge from former California Governor Ronald Reagan during the Republican primaries. This is odd. You don't often see a sitting U.S. president face a strong challenge within the primary. I mean, I'm thinking back to like 1912, when William Howard Taft faced a serious challenge from former President Theodore Roosevelt. But honestly, most of the time, the party sticks with the sitting president. Gerald Ford fights off that challenge, ends up being the Republican nominee, and is squaring off against Jimmy Carter of Georgia. Jimmy Carter is an interesting case for the Democrats. He's a moderate Democrat, so he's not aligned with the anti-war movement, student protest, any of that. But also, he has executive experience as the governor of Georgia. But he doesn't have any Washington connections, which means all of that mud that is now covering all of those Washington politicians, none of that is on Jimmy Carter. Now, sort of the sad part about the story is that we see a noticeable decline in the number of Americans who voted in the 1976 election. You could just almost feel how disgusted people were with American politics at that time. But Jimmy Carter is a born-again Christian, and he is presenting this idea that we're going to move forward, we're going to tackle our serious problems. We still are dealing with stagflation and unemployment. And so Jimmy Carter really wants to make that his focus. And I think for his victory, it shows that the American people wanted that as well. So coming back to our questions to think about, how does the Watergate scandal turn into an impeachment crisis for President Nixon? The committee to re-elect the president was using political dirty tricks in an effort to secure Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. But honestly, Nixon had done so much good in the realm of foreign policy that people were willing to go with him again, despite the terrible economy. I mean, we look back at the results of the 1972 election, and we see just how many people supported his re-election. And then how does the Watergate scandal lead to the election of President Jimmy Carter? People are done with politics. I mean, they're done with Washington-style politicians and the kinds of scandal that stunk up Washington with Watergate. And so they go with a political outsider and President Jimmy Carter.